these are the lines having to do with what we call a fork, or a Y line, but we'll call it a fork. Now, as we progress from numero uno, number 1 up here, where we have just an indicating line in a certain organ area. Now, after a while, as we start getting into a stressful situation, which could be from toxins in the environment, the wrong type of food, smoking cigarettes, alcoholism, drugs, and so on, then gradually this particular red line starts moving downward toward the iris of the eye. Now, we're not talking about moving upward into a healing crisis. We're talking now about looking at what we would call moving downward into a disease crisis, which would be the opposite of a healing crisis. So the second thing, this little line will slowly move down to where it's a little more obvious to the eye. And then it becomes more obvious to the eye, where it starts reaching down toward the edge of the iris. And then suddenly, when a stress begins to really increase in the area of a certain part of the body, it starts moving into this type of a procedure, like a very, very wide Y is what we'll call it. And then as the stress on that organ increases because it's not able to cope with the environmental stress or the emotional stress or the physical stress that is placed upon it, we go from a wide Y, which really isn't a life-threatening thing, to a regular Y, and this is the one we should start paying close attention to. Now, this can be further back up in here, depending upon which organ it might be associated with. Remember, we talked about the proximity of the fork of the Y. We're interested right here at the fork. Now, is that going to be down here close to the iris? Or is that going to be back up here, further away from the iris? And if you remember, if it's close to the iris, then it's going to have to do with zone 1 and 2. If it's moving out to about this level, that will probably have to do with the endocrine system some way, zone 3. You got that? If it moves on out further, it's zone 4, 5, 6, and 7 as it goes out further. Any question on that? No, the fork moves, as well as the line. But you look at the area of the proximity of the fork to the edge of the iris, and that tells you the part of the body which is being affected adversely. You got that? And so the fork will move, but the lines will actually do the moving, but the fork remains pretty well fixated when it starts to form. Okay? Now, as we progress, the Y becomes more pronounced in what we call a narrow Y. And then it gets to be an extremely narrow Y, where in this case, oftentimes we start seeing the formation of tumors or cancers in the body at this level. And Dr. Stu Wheelwright, in his observations of this, if he found these, for example, up in the brain, to him it was always a brain tumor, which he told people. Okay, right here. A very narrow Y like that in the brain area between 11 and 1 o'clock would always be a tumor in the brain. Now, maybe that's true. Maybe it is not true. But I have seen situations where there is definitely a deterioration in the cell structures, which I would say would lead to an active tumor if you have a very narrow Y. Now, oftentimes this then encloses, and you have then what? An enclosure. Now we know that we've got a very active condition here. Even though it may be closed off or walled off from the surrounding tissue, we know that within that walled off area we have a major problem. Any question on this? Yes. Pardon me? Oh yeah. Come up here if you would.
Is that the same line in progression moving around, or is it
No, it's
it's
staying in one location, but it goes through all of these different formations in that one continual location. Like this would move down and then start forking and so on, and it will go through all of these stages in one location in the sclera of the eye, relative to one organ. It's not going to move around like this. I'm just showing the various stages that a person goes through as it's related to one position.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very good question. Anybody else have a question? Yes. Michael, come up here, please.
I can't remember having been told the significance of forks, say, as opposed to a fish hook. You know, what kind of separate significance do they have to a line or a line with a fish hook on the end of it?
A fish hook, now, let's say that we're starting to go through a healing process. And if you remember, if we go from a state of relative unconsciousness, we might have a line like this, and then it becomes a little longer like this, and then it becomes longer approaching the iris like this, and then when we come up to the level of fear, oftentimes these lines come all the way in then to the limbus, and then when we come up to anger and the person starts becoming more in control of their own environment, even though in a very destructive way, then the fish hook starts to form, and the line starts backing off from the iris, and you have the fish hook. Now that is a different situation than what we're talking about here.
Yes, so I'm just wondering what is the I mean, we've got several different types of forks there.
Yes.
What's the significance of a fork itself?
It shows, I would say, it would show that there's different types of environmental stress, emotional stress, physical stress, which is causing an object in the body or a part of the body to begin to move into a state of deterioration.
Okay. Thank you.
We could use a word profitably by saying like lowered electrical potential in the tissues, because oftentimes these will be associated with radii sceleris. They could be definitely associated with mucoprotein in an organ area where the cells are beginning to die because they're living in a sea of their own toxins that they can't get rid of because of the lymphatic congestion. Okay? It can be through a chemical material which the body is incapable of metabolizing and eliminating, and therefore that chemical material will settle out in the tissue of greatest weakness in the body as determined by the genetic code of that person. Energy overlays perhaps for any cause. And therefore all of these things would contribute to the deterioration of the tissue, which would then be reflected in the iris of the eye, and then in turn be indicated by the various formations of the lines in the sclera of the eye.
Right, yeah, so they're significantly different to fish hooks. Even
the fish hook would be like, let's say this began to heal. This particular line. Then you see a little hook begin to form, and this would begin to withdraw.
Yeah, like number 7's got a bit of a fish hook on it. But you're saying that
really.
That's
this
not
has
really.
to bend, yes, a little bit, but that'll have to really bend back into a real well-defined fish hook to consider that would be a healing sign.
Yeah, because you've said a narrow fork is quite well, Stu Wheelwright.
Pardon me?
Was it Stu Wheelwright?
Stu Wheelwright.
Yeah, he says that they're a sign of tumours.
He
A
says
narrow fork.
he says tumor.
Yeah.
I would say maybe. I would say this is a sign of the degeneration of the tissue from whatever cause, which I listed a little earlier there.
Yeah.
And whatever cause would cause this, when the body begins to heal, all of this goes back in the manner in which you see it. This actually draws back, like we heal, remember, from the inside out. And as we heal from the inside out, then this in turn backs off from the iris of the eye.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help? Okay. Now I might add also, Michael, as it backs off, that's when you start seeing the fish hooks forming. Okay. Thank you for that question. Sir John.
John, is there any significance in, we'll take number 6, if that fork starts right up near the top where you got the number 6, yes, and you cannot actually see a straight line forming and then fork. Fork seems to start from the one spot, as far as you can see back in the Sclera.
Yes.
Because it looks like two Sclera lines,
this much of
indication lines coming from the one spot.
Like this?
Yes, yes, but way back up near where the 6 is.
That could be, this again could be what Stu Wheelwright would call a brain tumor, especially if it was between, say, 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock, way up in the top of the brain area.
Yes, well, I have seen them, and they'll be really wide from 11 to 1, you know,
yep.
Because they start so far back that they keep going in that angle for a long way. You understand what I mean?
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful of looking at that.
Because it seems to be two lines starting at the one spot, rather than a straight line forking.
It could. I'm so glad that we're searching these things out here, and we want to clarify this as much as we can as we move along.
Moving along, have you noticed anything special when you have a fork coming down, and it forks out, and then you have other forks coming off the spokes of the fork?
You have a combination of factors here, like a tie-in.
Uh-huh.
And you would take you'd have an indicating fork here, and then you have a line coming out here, and it kind of forms another fork down here. That's like a tie-in. So you take this area, and you take this area,
and you hold them together.
And hold them together on a tie-in situation where you'd be holding points on this area and this area in the body electronics points simultaneously.
Gotcha.
And then the area disappears. We'll talk about tie-ins a little while.
Now, one other thing, probably another time, it might be, where you get, say, a heart line coming in, and you have another line coming in kind of on a diagonal that meets up right at the same spot close into the iris, like a reverse fork. What's is that, you just call that a diagonal degeneration line, or?
I think that's a dangerous line. I'll show you from the iris area. Let me see if I can find this for a moment. Hang on. Now, this is not what we would call the sclera. This is what we will call the stroma of the iris. And we're looking at, first of all, okay, very good. We're looking here at the large circle, which is one continual blood vessel, which is under the iris of the eye. This is clear back in the stroma of the eye, way down toward the pigment layer. The iris is up here in front, clear up in here, okay? And so this is a blood vessel that does indeed exist way down in the stroma. Now, the blood vessels will move from the greater circle, which we'll call this the greater circle, and will move into the smaller circle, which will be right around here, which will lie directly under what we call the ciliary frill, or the autonomic nerve wreath. And so you have other blood vessels way down in this area. And then you have blood vessels going down in and back and forth and around from the pupillary ruff on out. Now, we find that from a genetic, anatomical point of view, that people like you and myself will have what we will call an aberrant condition, where it goes into a diagonal form, which we call on the surface of the iris of the eye that we can observe, we call it a transversal. So this blood vessel, instead of moving from the greater circle to the smaller circle, or lesser circle as they call it, this blood vessel can come out across this way. You follow me? And or, instead of just being back in the stroma, that blood vessel can start back in the stroma, and suddenly you see this blood vessel coming clear up here on the top of the iris, which is another genetic abnormality. Now, wherever you find a genetic abnormality in the eye, that will oftentimes be associated with like crossed fibers, where you have a reduced life force in that particular area of the eye where you find that transversal in the iris. That would be a lowered electrical potential, or an actual lowered life force in that particular area. Now, that's hard to swallow sometimes. But here, for some of us who have had cancer several times, I'm talking now about myself, I've had a large number of these so-called transversals in the area where I did have at one time cancer. And this becomes quite a difficult thing to cope with, because you know what you have genetically to deal with, especially when your mother's 45 and she's dying of tuberculosis, when Dad tries to comfort her one night and you have this little guy appear on the scene that was totally unexpected. That's me. They took me down to the doctor. They thought my mother had a tumor and they wanted the tumor cut out. Well, the tumor happened to kick. And so therefore, as my mother was nearly dead and I was born, I was nearly dead. My whole eye was chock full of all these transversals. And then I wonder why I had so many problems. The transversals are nearly all gone now, because they change in structure to where you go through a massive healing crisis, and these transversals that are clear down up in here that show up on the surface of the iris of the eye all disappear. Now, what he is referring to would be a transversal in the sclera of the eye. And I believe that that should be treated in the same manner as an indicating line and a degenerating line together, because you're not just having one line coming in toward the iris now. You're not just having one degenerating line here. You're having a line coming in, for example, at the heart area on the left eye. You're having another line coming in and meeting it at a very definite transversal. It's neither a true indicating line, neither is it a true degenerating line. And so I would say that this area, which is cutting through all of this whole thing, much like a one of these little blood vessels cutting through and across fibers, you're dealing with the whole area which would be transversed or encompassed by this line from here up to here, I would say would be called into question. And where that line would be from organs out here, from this point, you follow me? And then you move in toward the area here with the other point, and sometimes you find a transversal in the iris of the eye following the same pattern. Does this help, sir?
Yes. Just
Okay.
for the record, when the lady went through a healing crisis where it seemed to start to change, it's still very obvious. She went back through a set of memories that she doesn't think of hers from this life, at least, and she had, fibrillation and a whole bunch of heart-lung symptomology there. So file that one for the record.
Yep.
That's quite serious by the sound of it.
Yeah.
I'll look closer.
Yeah. But this is where, in this particular area, when you have an indicating line, that's pretty well clean cut and decisive. Then you just have to look at the various angles that it interconnects with. But if you got a line like this, that's going to interconnect with everything in the eye. And so a lot of things are going to be associated with it. And so you're probably back in some genetic memory where the whole body was under tremendous duress, or you had some sort of a terrible accident or a terrible disease as something happened, and then the whole body was reflexed to that area, and it shows up genetically then as these, what I would call a transversal in the sclera, which would be equivalent to a transversal which you'd have in the iris of the eye. You got that?
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I got heaps of questions, but none relevant now.
Okay. I hope that helps a little bit. Are you sure there's no questions before we begin to... yes, Sydney. Where are we, Anita? Yeah, leave this here for now.
Those indicator lines that form in the sclera, would they be preceded by indicators in the iris itself?
Yes.
So
Preceded by?
The indicators in the iris itself.
The indicators in here would be directly related to the lines in the sclera.
They wouldn't precede it.
Precede it, you say?
They precede the lines in the sclera.
I've never considered that before. Thank you for the question. Let's look at it carefully. If you have a stricture, for example, in the autonomic nerve wreath, that will accompany and precede a cancer that will eventually form in that area. So you can predict future problems by looking at the strictures or the dents in the autonomic nerve wreath. That, I think, would be... Linda? Okay. Take good care of Ben, or Sam back there. He's a good one. Okay, now, the question is now, would different aberrant conditions in the sclera of the eye accompany and precede different lines in the sclera out here? So you got your iris here with your problems in the iris of the eye, and then would that precede then an indicator in the sclera of the eye, or the question would be, would the sclera indicator precede a gradual degeneration of the tissue as indicated in the iris? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, let me have you think about that for a moment, because that's a good question. I like your observations. We'll start with Andrea. Why would it be in the sclera? Pardon me? Okay. Andrea, first of all, thinks that perhaps this could be the indicator would begin in the sclera. Now, let's build a case for why it would begin in the sclera.
Because when you have a healing...
Pull that down a bit, dear.
Because when you have a healing situation, the sclera heals first, before the iris. That's been my observation.
Okay, have you seen the sclera change first before the iris changes?
Yes, in my own eyes.
Okay, now that has been seen, especially in the adrenal area that she was very interested in.
Yes.
Where we had the big black bush in the adrenal area. the sclera line, if you recall, pulled back
Yes.
from the iris of the eye before the black bush disappeared in the adrenal area.
Yes, that's correct.
So therefore, if the healing crisis is correct in its consideration of theory, then chances are that the line would begin to form first in the sclera before it would then crystallize in the iris. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would it be the wrong way around? Okay, come on, don't listen to what I say.
If it heals from inside out,
Yes?
the last thing to form, I think, would be the indicator lines on the sclera. So if they clear up first, then the iris has to clear up after.
Okay, so therefore what would form first?
What's in the iris?
Andrea, we don't know. All we knew is we had a black bush in the adrenal area, right? And we looked at the sclera line. And then, but when we start to heal, what happened to the sclera line? You thought the bush went first? Or did both go together? Question mark. This was a good question. Thank you very much. Sydney, thank you very much. Kyle?
From what I've put together so far in the last couple of years of looking, where I've bothered to look at the sclera as well, is that suppose you start with the fibers in an area in the iris that are at level 1, if you can find anyone that has that.
I haven't seen anyone that has that.
Oh, okay. Well, just in a few areas that have already been through severe crises, you see a fiber there. Now, just from putting together all the different observations so far, as that fiber goes into that area of the body goes into heightened activity, which would be a stress, that'll go bright white.
Slow down.
Okay?
Please repeat that again.
You go from a kind of a raised whitish fiber, and that goes into quite a severe stress, a heightened activity, shall we call it, where the iris fiber raises up and goes bright white.
Okay. Now that's where that iris fiber moves anterior. But is that a healing crisis? Or is that a hyperactivity of that particular part of the body which is represented by the one fiber?
Depends which direction you're heading.
Okay, let's look at it this way. If you have a healing crisis, the entire body will support the healing crisis and all of the fibers will be white. Okay. Now, if you're simply going into a state of agitation or cleansing, perhaps, or hyperactivity, then that one fiber in that one organ area, or several fibers in that one organ area, will all be white. There'll be just like a little piece of a pie there that'll be white.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, with that, you find that the sclera, as the fibers become more irritated, what I've seen is that the sclera line goes from kind of a happy, just a little tiny thin line, or almost...
A little thin line out here somewhere.
Yeah. And it shunks into the edge of the iris.
Correct.
Now, you deliberately put yourself into severe stress. You can watch that happen in areas that were originally quite happy.
And that will be associated then with the fibers in here of a hyperactivity, which is not going to be a healing crisis.
Yes.
But it's going to be definitely a change of consciousness which will affect that particular one organ.
Positive ions to that.
Okay.
Now,
do you get what Kyle is saying from his observation? As you have a fiber moving anterior up to bright white, anterior is moving forward from black to dark to gray to white. As that fiber moves out and you hit that hyperactivity, at the same time in the corresponding sclera line, that moves in toward the iris simultaneously. Andrea, question? No question.
now, next stage, And I haven't been watching for long enough to see the people go right through it enough times that I'm secure on this. But what seems to happen is once you get to that severe stress, if the body has all the nutrients that it needs, and the rest of the system can support the crisis, then the tissue settles back down, and the sclera line recedes, just back down to like a level 1 fiber level. It's healthy tissue. Now, if the system can't respond to the stress, and the nutrients are not there, then you have the sclera line there, and then you have the iris fibers starting to sink down. Now, as the body loses the battle towards the stress, it goes through a further disease process, and the sclera line kind of, the system can no longer, you can only flog a horse so long, then it collapses. And so then the sclera line goes
back toward
and
a
drops
unconscious
away,
state now.
and the fibers have dropped down at that stage. So I would say it depends which direction you're heading in and where you start from, or it depends where you see the sclera and the iris. Can you see the overall pattern there?
Now tie that in with the endothermic, exothermic reaction. I'm
Can't
going to
do
sit
that
down
yet.
here and enjoy that.
You do that part. I don't know that yet.
You do that. You've got all the information. Now put it together.
Okay. If you look at it, the iris fibers are raised up and hyperactive in one local area. You feel that area under your hand. Sometimes it's red hot. I got that much right. I've
So
watched that.
therefore, where are you on the scale? Above fear or below fear at the hyperactivity?
You're between fear and enthusiasm.
Okay, which would be a pain, right?
Yeah.
That's
It
your
hurts.
hyperactivity.
It's an acute area. It's overstimulated. It's in pain.
And so in general, you're going to have a lot of heat coming out of there, which would be what kind of a reaction?
Exothermic.
Exothermic reaction, correct. Now what will happen then as the cells deteriorate and start moving back down into the pigment layer?
The blood flow through those tissues drops. The polarity in the tissue drops, electrical potential,
Right?
and the area starts to go into chronic underactivity, which you can feel it with the back of your hand. It goes very cold.
Okay?
I felt
It
that
goes
too.
cold. Now listen carefully, folks. You have an endothermic reaction as you move from enthusiasm down to fear. Now this is disease crisis we're talking about. You're going down scale,
Like in shock.
like into shock. And you're suppressing it all from enthusiasm down to fear. Now, when you go from fear back down into unconsciousness, the body is going to have an exothermic reaction, and that's when you have these high fevers that are difficult to break, which will be not a healing crisis fever, but a disease fever. Are you with me on that? Okay. Reversing that, then, if you go through a very exothermic reaction from fear down to unconsciousness, what are you going to have when you're holding points and you're coming from unconsciousness back up to fear?
I was in my own thoughts. When you're coming from unconsciousness back up to fear, you will go cold.
You'll go cold. This is when that body will be ice cold coming back the other way. The reverse was going downscale, it's heat. Coming up to fear, it's cold. Now from fear up to enthusiasm then, what are you going to have, sir?
Heat.
Heat. And
Fever.
that's when you get into a healing process then. You have heat going upscale back up to enthusiasm from fear.
That all fits kind of nice.
Isn't that exciting?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now you keep that in mind, and that's very, very important. And we'll see that sclera lines move accordingly. We'll see the lines in the iris move accordingly. Any questions there? Now that has never been taught before in class, but it needs to be understood. You need to get Book 2 and Book 3 of the Logic and Sequence series where it goes into this material very thoroughly, and then you'll really be confused for a while until you get that straightened out. But you'll observe that by watching healing crisis after healing crisis after healing crisis, as well as the reverse of that, where people think they're well as they're on a junk food diet, and downscale they go. You see the exact opposite. We're coming from enthusiasm here. We're going, you can see my hand? We're coming down scale. We're at enthusiasm, and as we're coming down scale, Kyle, what type of process is it if you're going down scale? It'll grow cold. But you're going down scale. Is that healing crisis or disease crisis? Disease crisis. You're going down scale. Doug Morrison came up with the word disease crisis, and I love it. Okay? And we never had that before. I never thought of it, but the thing, because I'm always thinking positive of everyone going up through healing crisis. But the disease crisis is where you come down scale. And so as you come down from enthusiasm down to fear, that will be cold. Okay, you ready for this? What happens if you have a good, healthy runner? And he's out just beating himself to death, putting his body under severe stress. What does the body feel like when it's come in from a long run? Pardon? Ice cold. But if a person's extremely, extremely weak and they're out exercising, then what will their body be? Hot. Because you're still putting it under stress, and downscale they go. So from enthusiasm down to fear, the body will be ice cold. From fear down to enthusiasm, doing exactly the same thing, putting the body under severe stress, it'll be very, very hot. And so you'll find out where people are on the scale by looking at their heavy exercise program and by seeing what's happening to them if they put their body under undue stress. Now, if you have good nutrition in the body, and if you're really doing it right, you know, with good nutrition, and let's say that you're a weightlifter, and you're working at doing repetitive lifts, what happens to your body on a weightlifter? Come on, what do? They come into a burn, don't they? And their muscle structures will burn and burn and burn as they go through the series of reps. And what do you feel on their body when they're going through this burn? Radiation coming off of it. The whole body is radiating, it's burning up, exothermic reaction. You're coming upscale from fear up to enthusiasm. But what if you have a weightlifter who has never had a good diet, and they have a junk food diet, and they're trying to really burst those old muscles? What do you feel on their body? Ice cold, because they're going downscale and they never get into the burn. They only get into a burn where there's a regeneration. And you find a lot of the weightlifters start out with big black brown eyes, and after they've gone through that burn quite a lot under a very good nutritional program, their eyes start turning green. Anita and I have both seen this in our weightlifters that we work with in the Cook Islands. They had big brown eyes, they get through the burn, they take a good nutritional program, they go through the burn, and their muscles regenerate. Okay? We brought in four gold medals and 1 silver and a bronze from the South Pacific Games with our little weightlifting crew. And they were the tops of their weight divisions. And I'm very happy about that because all of them have done a lot of practice of body electronics. And they know what it's like to regenerate their muscles, to put them in absolute top physical condition. That's exciting to me. Little tiny 20,000 population pulls down all these gold medals that put some of these big countries to shame. One fellow started with really not that good a physical condition, and he's number 7 in the world now in his category. And he's just a young buck just getting started. So we're into making bodies perfect, and as bodies become perfect and we get our mind on straight, then the mind can become perfect. The consciousness of man, because we use the physical body as a springboard for that. It's very exciting. Now, you take a person at below fear, and they're on a junk food diet, and you put them under tremendous stress of weightlifting or any other physical sport, and they're at fear, they're on a junk food diet, what is their body going to feel like when it's put under tremendous stress? It's going to be ice cold. And down they go. Is that true? Come on. Is that true? Okay, if you come down from enthusiasm down to fear, what is it? Cold. That's coming down scale. That's disease crisis. Then what's it going to be if you go from fear down to unconsciousness? It's going to be very hot, and their body will be extremely hot. They'll be emanating all this energy, but it's a disease crisis that they're going down through, an exothermic reaction. Because they're on a junk food diet, they're tearing their body to pieces. They're making the body much ill. It's not cold, it's hot. That will be what? Cold, ice cold, because the person's overworking their body. And then when you're coming back upscale from fear to enthusiasm, then it's an exothermic reaction, and you have all the radiation coming off of their body. Pardon me? Fear is a fulcrum. I call it a fulcrum, and this is where you have a sine wave. Okay, as you're looking at the graph, here's your exothermic reaction to fear, and then your endothermic reaction to unconsciousness, starting at enthusiasm. And so your first big, this is book 3 and book 2. The charts are there. Yeah. But then you have 7 levels within each of your scales as you go down. Each emotion, as you go through it, will have 7 levels within 7 levels. It becomes even more complicated. But then you'll understand the little exothermic reactions while the body is ice cold. And you'll understand the endothermic reactions while the body's boiling hot. And you can have both at the same time. Anita.
Well, I would like your comments on this. I've noticed 2 different signs in the sclera. I've noticed lines in my sclera which I see all the time, and then I see lines that under acute stress appear and then go away like the following day. Like for instance, in the Cook Islands, I notice when I go into town, when they spray malathion along the paths, I come back home and I notice a line in my sclera in the thymus area. And then I stay home the next day and that line is gone. Whereas there's other lines in the sclera that I feel are more permanent, that I see all the time, but I notice in the iris that I don't see a change in the thymus area. I see the iris stays more constant, the sclera shows more of an acute stress, or eventually it goes into a permanent stress. That's what I...
Kyle, would you answer the question, please?
If the sclera line comes all the way in and goes into really severe stress, and you weren't on a nutrient saturation program and living the way you live, then the iris seems to start to change at that point and go through a degeneration.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but I'm just saying
But you recover.
that I see more of a dramatic change within the sclera than in the iris. Like, the iris seems to stay the same even though I'm going through that stress with the malathion. I mean, if I had it every day, I'm sure there would be more degeneration in the iris.
We've had it every day.
Yeah. Is that what you're saying too?
I don't know, I have a brown eye. Maybe mine looks a little different. I'll have to look at a few blue eyes, but mine kind of goes, when the area goes into a acute hyperactivity, the fibers raise up and look yellowy brown.
So you see a dramatic change in the iris also?
Not dramatic.
But very, okay.
I see a little one.
Morris, we have a suggestion for your cover. Do you think a cute line in the sclera would be beneficial for your cover? Acute line? Okay. I think we've answered that question. Okay. Now, in the case of Anita, she'll take and throw off the malathion, but she'll have a very severe reaction for a day or two of heavy diarrhea, headaches, mucus discharge, and then she's back to normal again because she has reached a point where she's able to throw off very quickly the effects of this chemical contamination, which can be quite severe. The question is, if she didn't know it was malathion, would she have the same reaction? The answer is yes, because we've had that reaction without really paying attention to the rotten cabbage smell that was there. We just kept right on trucking, so to speak, and both of us had the same reaction together. And then we knew it was malathion afterwards because we remember the rotten cabbage smell. Michael, is your pencil up? Come up here, please.
I was wondering, when you and Anita get these allergic reactions to malathion, do you get any allergy lines or little blue blotches in the sclera at all?
Yes.
Any sign of that?
Yes. My whole thymus area became an absolutely dark, deep blue when our house got fogged by the malathion sprayer that went by. They just fogged the whole area for 5 minutes, when only one little bit of indication from an aerial spray from a helicopter will destroy the mast cells and destroy the immune system for the human being. We got sprayed terribly.
Yeah.
I have a very good friend of mine, by the way, who these people were told, oh, you can eat this stuff. The total stuff is totally non-toxic to human beings. And Harry was sprayed all over his body with pure with the malathion that they were spraying. He became deathly ill for 4 months. And his immune system was just a huge blue blotch in the sclera of the eye, in the medially at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, medially in both scleras.
Okay.
Now that comes back with cleansing.
Yeah. Those allergy lines, like the blue blotch or little red lines close to the iris.
Yes. We don't have those.
Right. You just get.
We just get the blue blotch in the sclera because my allergy lines are gone, and so is Anita's. I think ours are pretty gone. Anita can tell you more because she's highly sensitive to any sort of chemical contamination.
Well, I got a red line in the sclera in the thymus.
You had an indicator line.
Yeah, I had an indicator line that came in. Instantly, it came in. I mean, I just looked at my eye, I couldn't believe it. Sure. I had a red indicator immediately and went away the next day. Of course, I took tons and tons of Schweitzer. So and oxygen. So it went away the next day.
And it went away.
That's what I was saying. That sometimes in a real acute stress, sometimes the sclera shows instantly. That's what I was trying to point out.
Yeah, it's quicker than the iris, you're saying.
Yeah, because if I looked in the thymus in my iris, I don't think I would have noticed that much of a difference. Maybe if I looked really, really, really carefully. Oh, maybe. Okay.
Come up, sir. Start over.
Suppose you have a night on some alcohol and you look in the liver area, get a line come in, and then I've seen this on other people, of course. And you look in the liver area, it's just a little hyperactive if it's a healthy liver to begin with, which most aren't. But it's local. It's not the whole eye.
Yeah,
just one little.
Thank you, sir.
Another question?
Oh, another question.
Just because it's tied in with the hot-cold thing, I met someone who went on a very diligent raw food diet. Took all his supplements, pretty much. Really very, is soaked nuts and seeds and sprouted legumes and things every day. Really very thorough. And his body started to go white, and then winter came and his hands went blue. And
for how long?
Well, long enough till he got a fright, and then decided to start eating cooked food again to warm himself up.
Okay, what happened?
Well, I'm just thinking about it.
Did he have his
Asking him.
points held?
He stopped point holding.
He stopped point holding.
He stopped point holding.
Okay, we didn't ever got through the healing crisis then, did we?
Uh-huh.
That's simple. This is where a lot of people, they start having symptoms that rupture, not just dampen their feelings, but rupture their comfort zones entirely, and they stop the very thing that started the project, and then they're left in that for some time. And it's difficult for them to get out. They don't understand the whole necessity of raw food and enzymes and so on versus your cooked food. Now you have your Ayurvedic medicine, remember, which is a very heavy situation. And the Ayurvedic medicine insists upon your cooked food and balancing and so on. So, say that again, sir. For the mic. Sydney, come up, please.
What was the final conclusion regarding what comes first?
Say that again, please.
What's the final conclusion about what comes first on that, the iris or the sclera?
Did anybody come to a final conclusion on that? Or would you probably conclude from what has been stated here that it's almost simultaneous one with the other? I think it's pretty well simultaneous. If you have an acute condition, I would say it shows up in the sclera quickly. If you have a chronic condition, it then is permanently crystallized in the iris. But I think that an acute condition will occur very quickly in the sclera. Some other people might say, well, an acute condition will also influence the fiber level in the various organs. So if you have an acute condition, you might have little white lines in the fiber. So perhaps we could conclude simultaneous. Peter, what do you think, sir? Now, I'm not paying you for it, so your opinion is not worth very much. What do you think, Peter? Now, Peter has been an absolute keen observer of eyes now for some time.
You'll have to ask me the question again because I was away on something else.
The question is, bottom line, which came first, the lines in the sclera or the condition in the iris?
I would say that I'd have to keep my options open on that because it varies with different people at different times.
That's safe. That's safe.
Well, you would say the same thing.
Oh, yes, that's the greatest cop-out in the world. It's individual differences, you know. But I think that's safe. Can we all agree to that? Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you, Peter.
I don't know if it's appropriate to bring it up here, but I haven't seen anyone yet. But if you've got to the state where you're living on prana, is that then a state of endothermic? To pull in the elements?
In the United States, we had a breatharian society. And in the United States, the president of the breatharian society, supposedly was living on prana. And he gained a worldwide reputation for learning how to breathe properly, to take the prana and transmute that into the elements in the body that are probably necessary for survival. And I believe that is a true principle. And he continued with this worldwide reputation until they found that every night when he went home he was an absolute junk food freak. And he was a junk food addict, and he ate all this, you know, carbohydrates and all these other things that nobody knew anything about but him. Now, that was a disillusionment for the entire breatharian society in the States at the time. But I do believe that there are some people who have existed in reality in the Catholic Church where they lived for years only on the communion and the wafer of bread, mind you, one wafer of bread, and they were able to breathe in the life from the universal source and convert that through the biological transmutation into every single element that the body needed for survival. So I do believe this is possible.
That would need to be endothermic.
That would definitely be whatever the person needed to regenerate whatever was necessary in the body at that time. Now, we do have people who have reached a point in where they're ageless, where they might have a little cup of very weak tea, an herbal tea, every day. Just a weak cup of tea, an herbal tea. And they might live on maybe one dried apricot or a couple of dates or maybe a few raisins a week. And they live on that type of a diet, and everything that they take, they're able to manifest into living, solid flesh.
That still has to be endothermic.
Well, whatever it would be necessary at whatever level the body would be.
To be able to pull it into the body.
Yeah. But as you progress up to a state of enthusiasm, your intake of food will become less and less. I might add, when you're terribly sick, your intake of food is less and less. And as you come gradually up into fear, at the state of fear, you eat everything that's in sight and everything that holds the food. You know, you eat everything. And as you come from a fear level back on up to, gradually up to a state of enthusiasm, your diet begins to decrease again in consumption.
I did say that I didn't know anyone at that stage.
Yes, sir.
My motivation for saying this, John, is really that my motivation for talking now is to do with what came after what John said about when a person's on a nutritional program and then they don't have point holding, then they go into it inverts, it stops. And just a minute, I'm sitting on a button.
I don't believe I said they go into an inverted situation. I think I said they go into a healing crisis, but they don't get through it in a quick time, and that ruptures all of their comfort zones.
Yes, if they don't have point holding. And my feeling is this, that if they went and lay or lie down somewhere or sat somewhere and just brought their awareness to their body and staying with the moment, that they, you see, puts a lot of addictive process on point holding. And although point holding is very powerful, we don't want to put everything outside ourselves. With our consciousness, we have the ability to take our awareness when we know into that area of tension and surrender, providing we don't move when the tension comes up.
Anita, come up here, please.
I think what you said is very beautiful, and I wish everyone could do such a thing. But my experience with working with people is, if you're working with a farmer who's a meat eater, and he doesn't know anything about meditation or anything about stilling the body, or he's completely out of this realm, I mean, to tell him to do such a thing sometimes is really far out. So that's where the body electronics comes in.
It's a barbaric technique for barbarians.
Yeah. Not that I want to get people addicted to point holding, but sometimes it's the only way to get them to still the body, to lay on the table and have their points held.
Oh, I don't deny that. I don't deny that. But I'm talking to the people who are in this group at the moment, and you address your communication at different levels. I'm not saying that we wouldn't they could take that approach necessarily, but it's amazing what potential everybody has, and you never know when it's going to change. So there was a very interesting book comparing Eastern approach to self-understanding with the Western approach, and it said the Westerner really like to know the terrain before they go into it. There's no need to keep it mystical. That's one of the characteristics of the Eastern, where the guru knew the terrain, knew the stages, and then would give the appropriate response to the student at the right time. But in the West, let us say, where we're trying to find the balance between the East and the West, then it is perhaps you can give the terrain. Your intuition will tell you when you can give the terrain. Some people you can't give the terrain to, maybe, and something has to rely on intuition, but you can give the terrain. That's all I'm saying. An overview of the terrain, and then say, well, and then this is where we start.
I believe it's a matter of commitment and intent. Now, Anthony, you look to me like you're a man of truth, and you're searching, and you're looking for the answers. You're searching. Every minute of your day is spent, trying to reach higher levels. Now, I talk to a lot of people that they don't have this understanding of commitment and intent. They're going through the day doing their regular daily things. I'm not saying people in this room, but I have a lot of patients that are, I'd like to say, simple people. They might be a housewife, or they might just be whatever. And they're not taking that commitment and intent to look every moment, every second at increasing their consciousness. So these people, if you just leave them and they go on the program, then they don't have that commitment and intent. So like what John says there, they'll go into a healing crisis and then they get kind of lost because they don't have the commitment to take it up, to go through the process that you were talking about. They're just thinking, oh, can I get rid of this pain in my elbow? Or can I get rid of the pain in my hip or whatever, or, can I heal my diabetes?
Let me say this. There comes a time in the progression of every human being where, because of their notions based upon belief systems, judgments, or reactions, if there's a difference, that they will continue to react and continue to base their decisions on, shall we say, involutionary judgments that they have already made long ago and that are suppressed below the level of consciousness. It takes a tremendous amount of guidance and direction by what I will call a master on the path who has mastered that type of situation to bring a person out of his, what he calls a virtue, which in reality is a reactive mechanism. And a person cannot do this on their own without guidance from somebody who can help them over a hurdle. You take even Buddha, before he attained his enlightenment, he tried every single thing from long fasts to self-denial to different forms of asceticism and so on, until he reached the middle path, the middle way. But yet he did all these things to the best of his ability until he finally came to the point where he made his, what we will call his enlightenment. Now at that point of time, there was a group liberation of mankind during the day of Buddha, because he went through the necessary pain to morphogenetically liberate the souls of men who lived in that age. During Jesus' time, Jesus went through the same thing before his ascension or resurrection. And he went through that group liberation, which is recorded in the annals of the Sanhedrin records and in the writings of Pontius Pilate that have lived to this day. So this group liberation thing comes about when people make this breakthrough, not only for their own individual basis, for which we call purification, but for their sanctification, where all men are freed at that moment of time from the bonds of death, so to speak, that has enslaved them for centuries. Now that is yet to come on a group level on earth again, and it will come through the actions of people following these universal laws that we're speaking about. But this cannot be done individually, but only through guidance. And you reach a point when your greatest virtues, you will begin to understand that which you feel are your greatest virtues will be your greatest binding reactive mechanisms which hold you into abject slavery that you know nothing about until you're there. And then you go through a state of total confusion for a period of time until you become free of your fixation on that which you claim to be your greatest virtues. I'm sure you don't understand what I have said, but I'll let you quandary it for a while, because I have been there and I know exactly of which I speak in these matters. The reactive mechanism cannot be torn out without guidance from somebody who has been there. Buddha had the greatest teachers of his time, and he sought them out, and he was obedient to their directions until he understood the lessons that he had gone through. But it wasn't just intellectual, it was experiential. Christ did the same thing with his travels to the Far East and to the teachings of the Magi and other great teachers in Egypt and great teachers at that time in the islands of the sea, which would be the British Isles. Are you all aware that Jeremiah established his schools in Ireland during the reign of the prophet Jeremiah? And the greatest schools in the world at one time were in the British Isles, or actually in Ireland. And this is a history that all of us will eventually need to understand, because it'll help us to understand where we have come from individually. Now, I agree wholeheartedly with what Anita said. I agree wholeheartedly with what Anthony said. But there's a lot more than meets the eye, and we have to go beyond this barbaric activity of body electronics, which helps to stimulate people to get them through the pain of the emotional body which holds people in bondage, so they're able then to penetrate the mental body and start seeing things in perspective where they're capable of discernment. Now, I hope you picked up what I have said here, because it's absolutely imperative that you understand it, that your own pathway might be clear. Okay? Is that on tape? Is that on tape? Good, because that's exceedingly important to understand. A lot of people think they know, and they know in part, but they don't know the pathway that leads to the liberation of the soul. And this is what we must eventually attain to. And it is as simple as non-resistance. It is as simple as lovingly and willingly enduring all things. It is as simple as eternal gratitude for the experiences of life. And it is as simple as loving unconditionally and forgiving unconditionally every single person, every single individual that you've ever come across, including yourself. And that's what it boils down to. We can have all of the mandalas we want, we can have all of the vibrations we want, we can all have all the rituals and signs and symbols which trigger the mind of man, but bottom line, it boils down to what I have just given you. It's that simple. Any comments? Time for a break. Take about 10. When we have our thoughts, feelings, and spoken word, those control the very morphogenetic field around our body, which determine then the very structure of matter And what affects one part of the body cannot help but affect every other part of the body simultaneously. And therefore, to be accurate, when the sclera changes, you also have corresponding simultaneous changes in the iris. And this is why we may get a little bit confused when we see it both ways. We may not recognize a change in the iris, but what will affect one part of the body cannot help but affect every other part of the body and the emotions connected with it. So everything changes together and simultaneously would be a correct interpretation. Now we can play with these things, which came first, the chicken and the egg and so on. That does not apply when it comes to the physical body as being an outer physical manifestation or a crystallized manifestation of the morphogenetic field, which in turn is determined by the thought process itself. Any question on that? Yes, sir?
With the when you have the egg white situation in the sclera,
the hard-boiled egg white.
yeah,
Yep.
you'd still have the indication of all the organs in the iris.
You see what?
Would all the organ indication in the pockets and what we have in the iris, would that still be visible?
Yes. Yes.
Well, one's reacting without the other then.
Yes. What you would have basically, if you want to look at this from one particular standpoint, when a person is at pure enthusiasm, like a little baby who has just been born, they have a perfect iris. And then gradually the imperfections in the iris begin to form. But you'll find also reports from people that their mothers or their fathers or their close relatives, just before the time of death, the eye becomes perfectly clear. Just before death. And at this time we'd also have the movement toward a hard-boiled egg white in the sclera of the eye. Now, if you're looking at a saint, on one hand you will see a person with a very clear eye. On the other hand, people who have given themselves over to a completely a reactive state where they are identified with matter, their eyes become perfectly clear also. When the thing is, their eyes can be absolutely beautiful at either end of the spectrum. Now, this is why there are a number of people, for example, when they encourage people to go through certain types of involutionary activity, the person becomes, shall we say, they appear to become more lucid. They appear to become more clear in their thinking. They appear to have tremendous reasoning abilities, but when you get down into it, they're just simply robotized, where they're totally a reactive organism. You have many people who have filing cabinets full of material, like for example on cancer. And they will testify that when you take certain drugs into their body, of chemotherapy and so on, that the cancer goes into remission. As you push the person downscale, when the person comes back upscale again, the cancer does reoccur. But the appearance is that the cancer goes into remission or even disappears from the body as you go downscale into identification with matter. And so when you change the, I'll use the word, the mental terrain, which controls the morphogenetic field, which controls the structure of the body, you change that mental terrain, the morphogenetic field changes, and the physical body changes. But that change can be either evolutionary, going in a positive direction toward a freeing of the mind, or involutionary, where the person goes down into identification with matter. And this is as I see it. Okay, I've seen that many times. It's as you work with people who are deathly ill, and you have people literally dying in your arms, you know, and as they're passing on, their eye becomes perfectly clear, and the eyes do, and the whole eye, and the white of the eye becomes absolutely clear. I had one of our instructors in the United States by the name of Craig Peterson. It's I forget the Jillian Craig Peterson. She's a great artist on the East Coast. She had a man living in her home in his later years of his life called Paul Brunton, who wrote a number of interesting books about the secret of India and the secrets of Egypt and so on. And Paul Brunton influenced a lot of people back in the 40s and 50s with his brilliant writings. Now, Paul Brunton had dark chocolate brown eyes. And while he lived in Jillian's home in his latter years, prior to his death, he went through a time when he was totally blind, could not see a thing, as his body was literally burning up from one end to the other. This took several days, as I recall, where Jillian said how this went for several days with his total blindness. And when he came out of this healing crisis, or whatever it was, his eyes were clear blue. Absolutely clear blue. And shortly after that, the man passed on. But she told this story before the entire class of instructors in the United States when we had seminars there. It was about 10 years ago. I thought you'd like to know that. It's an interesting story. But this happens, the eye becomes perfectly clear when you reach a point of near sainthood. And oftentimes the person then has the full knowledge with a very healthy body that they're going to pass on. And they say, my life is done, I've done my job, I'm on my way. And they leave. So, but they're leaving with a clear mind, with a clear conscience, and a very healthy body. Any comments? Anita. Anita. No, I'm only medium rare.
I just wanted to ask John, when we see a colour or a situation, when we see a colour or a situation in the fibres of the eye, is that the vibratory rate coming from the organ that's indicating that on the fibres?
As I understand it, the fibers represent the central nervous system, and which would then reflex from the organ that is undergoing whatever changes it's going under. And there is some material in that little handout that you have here that goes into how the blood vessels vascularly are affected, which would affect the iris of the eye. I think you'll find that a fairly physical opinion. But if we understand that the thought, feeling, and spoken word of the individual create the energy field, which we'll call the morphogenetic field around the body and inside the body, that then determines the very structure of matter itself and will reflect in the fiber changes in the iris of the eye. And so you have a tie-in between the mind, the emotions, and the body, where we're looking only at the outer crystalline end result.
So when the fibres are clear, are we looking at the pigment deep in the eye to give the blue?
Yes.
So the eye doesn't actually change colour, the blue's there all the time?
Yes. So you have in the very pigment layer, you have a violet printer's ink type thing, a dark violet, and that filters up through the fibers to give it the blue appearance.
Good.
Yeah, we all have blue eyes, we just can't see it yet. But anyway, what I wanted to apologize to Anthony if I offended him in any way, because some people at the break said that I had taken him on, and my intent was not to do that in what I was saying. I just felt like I wanted to give this knowledge over because I thought that it might affect a person, a client of yours, from living or dying, because I've seen people where you tell them to still the body, and their reactions within them are so strong that they could just die. And so my intent was to just give over the knowledge I had, not to you understand that? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. It's not just stilling the body. It's surrender also to the moment and that sensory awareness. It's not stilling the body and just giving up. It's actually staying with the tension of the memory and being aware of the moment through the things like the breath and so forth. So I agree with you on that, stilling without the other, without the dedication to inquire.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.